Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a live show brought to you by the LinkedIn News team, where we're talking as a community about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we all work. I'm Caroline Fairchild, editor-at-large here at LinkedIn, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. While all industries have had to make tough decisions about what to do with their workforce during these challenging times, few have dominated the headlines more than the tech industry, which has had to shed hundreds of thousands of workers amid this pandemic. Just yesterday, Uber announced it was going to have to go through a second round of layoffs. 3,000 employees have lost their jobs, and they're shutting down 45 offices. This amounts to Uber losing about a third of its workforce in just over a month. Other big tech companies, TripAdvisor, Lyft, Bird, Lime, they're making big decisions with their workforce right now. And earlier in May, Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky also had to announce that a third of his workforce was going to have to be laid off amid this pandemic. Right before he made that decision, he sat down with LinkedIn's editor-in-chief, Dan Roth. Let's take a look at what he had to say about that difficult decision.
But I said, I'm not going to hide. No matter how hard it is, no matter how bad it gets, I'm going to look every one of our employees in the eye. I'm going to tell them how bad it is. I'm going to tell them what I do and don't know. And I've been on that journey with them every single Thursday for the last 6 weeks. And this has just been a bit of the journey. It's been, one of the hardest 6 weeks of my life. I think I'm not unique. I think that we are all, in a broader sense, going through something that's unprecedented. And I will tell you that running a company rooted in travel, whose mission is to bring people together, a lot of things go wrong in a pandemic.
A lot of things do go wrong, and Chesky is right that he is not alone. There are lots of CEOs who are having to navigate this crisis in real time. And while layoffs are not something that is exclusively happening in a pandemic, the response that we've seen both on and off LinkedIn has been like something that we've never seen before. Hundreds of workers are coming to LinkedIn asking for help from their network. We have Andrea here, who is a user experience researcher at Airbnb, sharing that she was laid off, and we had thousands of comments from people reaching out to their network, looking to see how they could help Andrea and other workers like her. It's like unlike we've ever seen before. I think in this global pandemic, people are really hoping to help each other, and we'll talk about that later on in today's show. We have Rahan here as well, announcing that he also is looking for his next opportunity, and he was met with open arms by the LinkedIn community, who had comments and questions about what they can do to support his next play. So on today's show, we are going to speak with two workers who are recently laid off from Airbnb. They're going to tell us what's going on the ground with them, what the job market is like for them, and also how they're thinking about their next opportunity amid so much uncertainty in the job market and in the world right now. We're also going to talk with Kim Scott. She's the author of Radical Candor and an advisor to several tech leaders in Silicon Valley and beyond. We'll get some insights that we hope to share with you about how you can navigate this crisis for your business and how you can communicate and have difficult conversations with your employees during this challenging time. But before we get to our guests, I want to hear from you. The whole point of this show is to have a conversation as a community about how the coronavirus is impacting all of us. What is going on in your community? What is going on at your company? Let us know in the stream. I'd love to say hello, and we'll have a conversation hopefully about that on today's show. And if you have questions for our guests, please let us know that as well. And with that, I want to bring on Kim Scott. Hi, Kim. How are you? So good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us on Business Unusual.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start with you. Tell us what's going on the ground. I know that you advise a lot of tech leaders in Silicon Valley and beyond. What are you hearing on the ground right now, and what seems to be top of mind as so many leaders are having to navigate through uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that the one of the largest things that leaders are struggling with is that there's so much we do not know right now. And it's very hard for a leader to stand up in front of their team or get on a Zoom with their team and say, I don't know. I think it's one of the things leaders are really having to learn. But there's three important things to leading through a crisis. One is compassion. And it's sort of obvious why we need compassion. And I think we just saw a great example of that from Airbnb. The other thing we need, though, is truth, is candor, as I like to call it, because there are things we know. We do, and usually the things we know are sort of bad news. And it's so important to be clear about the bad news, because if you aren't clear about the bad news, then people imagine even worse news in a crisis. And the third thing we really need is action. We need people, all of us, but especially our leaders, to take the right action, to do what they can do to help.
I think it's really important to bring in that action component of this, but take me back to the beginning of this crisis when it almost was like decision paralysis for a lot of leaders in terms of so much uncertainty, not sure where to move. Do you feel like the tech execs that you spoke with understood, say in March, the huge impact this was going to have on the industry overall?
Yes, I do. I spent one of the companies that I coach is Torch, and which offers coaching, online coaching, and we started talking immediately about what they needed to do to cut costs to get to profitability, and as soon as it happened, and that was really hard because that's not the mentality of most tech company. Most tech companies are they're going to grow their way into greatness, and now we needed to rethink the way that we're growing, and that is a very different way of operating, and then communicating that to the team again with compassion and also with honesty, and then taking the right actions. And in some cases, as we've just seen, leaders have had to lay people off. And that's really difficult in a crisis because because unemployment is so broad. Another one of the things we really talked about is what are the things we can do to help people after we've laid them off retain the sense of community? Because one of the important things that work gives us is a sense of community. And I think we've seen great examples with Airbnb and keeping people connected. LinkedIn has done an amazing job allowing people to sort of reach out to their networks. And I think another thing that is so important right now is coaching and learning. And that's part of the reason why we're offering sort of some coaching classes to everyone. Usually we offer to specific companies.
For those of you who are just joining the stream, this is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we work. I want to say hi to Richard from California, James from Atlanta, Molly from Massachusetts, Justin from Texas. I'm here with Kim Scott. She's the author of Radical Candor, and we're talking about how the tech industry has been impacted massively by this crisis. If you have questions for Kim about what's going on with your industry or on the ground, let us know. She's saying hello. We'd love to have a conversation with you about that on today's show. Kim, I want to go back to this communication of layoffs. We just heard from Brian Chesky talking about how just communicating all of this has been one of the worst days of his life. It's a sentiment I've heard from so many leaders on the ground right now who are so attached to their businesses and their growth. And so having to go through these layoffs is so emotionally challenging. What is your advice to the tech execs that you're advising in terms of how to effectively communicate this difficult decision to, in some cases, thousands of workers?
I think the most important thing is to be compassionate with yourself, because it is really hard for the leaders, but also to remember, as bad as it is for you as a leader, it's worse for the people who you're laying off. And therefore you need to take specific action in order to help support them. And I think Brian Chesky and Airbnb is a good example of coming up with a way to help people stay in touch. And also the most important thing to do is to look at people and tell them yourself if you're the boss. You can't obviously do that in person, but at least over video, to have the conversation and to be willing to be in the room and to respond to the emotion of the moment and not to try to hide from the emotion of the moment. In fact, I think the moment that Radical Candor was born was about 20 years ago when I was at a tech company that was doing layoffs. And instead of doing the layoffs himself, the CEO of that company sort of hired somebody who I called a paid a-hole to do it for him. And that's a great example of what not to do. I realized in that moment that in these difficult leadership times, in the worst, when you have to make the very worst decision, which is to fire people, it's how you do it matters, and it matters enormously.
You've been a long-time proponent of Radical Candor, but I wonder how and if that equation of both giving good news and bad news in a way that is transparent, how does that change amid a global pandemic when there's so many things that people are going on in their personal lives, and there's also so much uncertainty about what next steps look like if you are laid off from a company that you thought you were going to maybe spend your career at?
I think that it's obvious why. So if Radical Candor is about caring personally and challenging directly, it's obvious why caring personally is important right now. It's obvious why compassion is really important in this moment. I think sometimes it's less obvious why truth is important, why the challenge directly part is important. And one of the mistakes that leaders make right now is to forget about the importance of telling people about the things they do know, of challenging directly, of sharing the bad news, of which there is unfortunately so much right now, and to share it openly and clearly, to be very direct. But when you do that, when you offer sort of love and truth at the same time, that is how you build trust. And that is what helps you take the action that you need to take. I think a common mistake that I'm seeing right now is something that I call ruinous empathy. And this is where you do care about people and you care about them so much that you don't want to say the things or share the information that's going to upset them, but they'd be better off in the long run knowing. So a big part of leadership right now is finding the courage to share the information and to challenge people so that you can act in a way that is going to move you forward.
And I'm seeing some comments in the stream right now from workers who have received that bad news, unfortunately, from their leadership in the past few weeks. You've pivoted a couple times in your careers, gotten through failed companies.
Yes.
Any advice for those who are doing that right now during this downturn in terms of how to move forward?
I think a few things that are so important when you find yourself suddenly unemployed. One is to sort of remember what is your recipe for happiness, and to take care of yourself. For me, in order to discover this, I actually had to quit my job and spend a whole year because I had been pushing so hard for so long. So take advantage of the opportunity and the time to figure out what are the things that you need to do to remain centered and really focus on those things. For me, I need to run, I need to sleep enough, and I need to talk to someone who I really love every day. And if I can do those things, then I can maintain an even keel even during a crisis. So figure out what is your recipe for staying centered. Spend this time, take advantage of this time to do that. Another thing you can do is reach out to your community. People really want to help right now. One of the things I think that people feel is helplessness to help. And so when you ask for help, you're asking people to invest in you. Don't think of it as a weakness. Think of it as a great strength to ask for help. And also realize that you're doing people in many ways a service to tell them what you need, because people really do want to help in this moment.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm seeing some questions in the stream about that. Joff asked, what are companies doing to provide emotional and personal support to employees adjusting to a virtual environment? I think we're seeing a lot of companies just being there for their employees during this difficult time. And I wanted to ask you this question from Heather. Kim, Heather asks, what advice do you have in furloughed situations? What level of ongoing communications should leaders have with employees that they have furloughed?
This is a really tricky situation, but I would argue that over communication is, if you're going to make a mistake, communicate too much. Don't communicate too little. One of the things that I did after 9/11, which was obviously a different sort of crisis, but I was leading a tech company and we had to do 2 rounds of layoffs. And one of the things that we did was to get together with everyone who we had laid off once a month. Obviously, you can't do that physically now, but you can do it virtually. You can do it over Zoom. And the importance of that was to remember that we are still a community. We are still human beings, and we still care about one another. The layoff doesn't change any of that human connection. And I think that is one of the things that can be so important. Don't feel like a layoff is not an excommunication, right? A layoff is a business decision, and you can still keep those human connections even after the layoff. Does that help at all?
I think it helps immensely, and I'm seeing some comments in the stream from people who are telling me, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of human connection. Kim, it's always a great time sitting down with you. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. And
That was Kim Scott. She's the author of Radical Candor, talking us through what she's hearing on the ground with tech execs who are having to make difficult decisions about what to do with their workforce during this challenging time. If you are just joining us, this is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking with you about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we all work. We have another panel of former Airbnb employees for you right now. I want to bring on Greg and Denis, who just went through the last round of layoffs we were discussing at the top of show at Airbnb. Greg, Denis, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights on today's show.
Thanks for inviting us.
Greg, I want to start with you. You are new to Airbnb. You joined in October of 2019. Did it ever cross your mind that layoffs were going to be on the horizon for you for this company back when you joined last fall?
Yeah, I think I was a returning intern, so I had only spent a few months at Airbnb before going full time. And to be honest, I think it was early on in my career. I was sort of expecting this to be my first stint. And I think it was sort of this natural progression where I realized, okay, this is getting a bit more serious when we started working from home. And then even people on my own team who were contractors being laid off first sort of gave like the first little warning, I think, that I might be laid off.
And Denis, you've been at Airbnb since 2013 in tech years, and it's like cat years. I'm pretty sure that's about 102 years to be at the one tech company. Talk to us a little bit about your career there and what the culture was like working there for 7 years.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I've been at Airbnb for 7 years across a range of roles. I've watched the company grow from 700 employees to over 7,000. So it's been quite a journey. And more recently, I was involved in disaster response work on programs known as open homes and frontline stays. These programs really focused on helping disaster evacuees, aid workers, refugees, communities affected by terrorism or mass shooting tragedies in the United States. We were providing free housing in partnership with governments and nonprofits to these beneficiaries. And more recently, with the Frontline Stays program, we were helping doctors and nurses on the front lines of COVID-19 efforts. So the culture in the company has always been incredibly cohesive, incredibly supportive. Really, to underscore Kim's earlier points, it's I think one of the few cultures out there where employees are deeply, deeply passionate about the mission and about supporting each other as part of that mission. So to be able to execute this work on behalf of Airbnb was very special.
And Greg, obviously the coronavirus pandemic has really impacted the travel industry. I want to go back. You mentioned some contractors were laid off, but talk us through that beginning part where your job security really seemed to be in jeopardy. How did executives at Airbnb communicate that? And what was that like personally, not knowing if your job was going to be around in, say, a couple weeks?
I think one thing that Brian Chesky and the Airbnb executive team do really well is promoting transparency. Weekly, they do a little Q&A where any employees can ask questions about anything that's on their mind. So nothing is sort of off the table here. And a lot of the exec team in general was pretty open, I think, to noting that layoffs aren't off the table. If it has to happen, it will happen type of thing. In general, I think it really depends on your manager who you're working with directly. I think the execs rely on one-on-one interaction really to sort of promote that nourishment of like a good community and a good company. And yeah, I think in general, if you have a good manager, I think the mentorship you sort of get from them in general is really helpful.
That's true for a lot of things. If you have a good manager, your job is a lot better. Denis, what about you? Was there a moment during this, before the layoffs were officially announced, where you thought that this might be an eventual outcome?
You know, as part of my job, because Airbnb is so ubiquitous in so many countries, as part of my job, I had to monitor the world for different global incidents, global disasters. And this was, of course, early in the news reports. I knew from as early as some of the global news reports out there about coronavirus that this was going to be a global issue. I knew that it would ultimately affect travel. And I think, again, to Kim's earlier point about candor and compassion, I think the leadership of Airbnb have always been incredibly forthcoming about the state of the travel industry as a whole and the impact of this pandemic on the company as well. So I anticipated it. I think really when I started to see it more personally was when the counties in the San Francisco Bay Area issued a shelter-in-place order, and our office closed, and workplace dynamics dramatically started to change, and folks started working from home and figuring out how to continue their work, no matter what priority was, from their homes. I think that's when it really hit me that this was serious for the entire company, and that all of us had to make personal life decisions, in the future. Did I expect layoffs? I'm not sure if I necessarily expected layoffs as much as I was just realistic about the impact to the travel industry and Airbnb being such a big part of it.
And the layoffs did eventually happen. A third of Airbnb's workforce was unfortunately had to get let go. Greg, what was the response from your community when that decision happened, both on and off LinkedIn? I know that Airbnb set up an internal directory. Talk me through how you've been communicating with Airbnb about your next opportunity, but also what you're seeing from your network in terms of how to navigate through this uncertainty, what to do next.
I think when it initially happened, there was sort of like a moment of silence, like all the dust had sort of settled. And really, I think all that could be left was empathy from teammates and close teammates. I think nobody really had in their control like whether or not this could happen. And really, because of the circumstances of a pandemic, like all people can really do is offer empathy. And then I think in general, Airbnb is doing a really great job in sort of helping to promote these employees that we're laying off as much as possible. I think in general, the employees that are being laid off are still seen as part of the company. So rather than them being cut as from the culture and cut from sort of like all the benefits of being at Airbnb, I think they're sort of seen as part of the family. And in general, they're treated that way, I think, going forward.
Yeah, and Denis, what has your experience been like? Obviously, you've been at Airbnb for quite some time. How has the transition been for you, and how has your network responded?
Sure, and I couldn't agree more with Greg on this. I think the initial reaction from everybody was a lot of empathy, particularly individual teams supporting one another. A lot of the outpouring of support that you displayed at the beginning of this program on LinkedIn was truly a display of how employees have demonstrated Airbnb's culture and values by showing up for each other, even after some employees, including contingent workers and full-time employees, have had to part ways with the company. In my experience, again, I think I was in the middle of a lot of critical work, and I recognized ultimately that these decisions had to be made for the future of the company. I know that Airbnb leadership was deeply saddened by this. I think Brian, Joe, and Nate was probably one of the hardest calls of their lives professionally. And I know one of the things they did say is that not only do we as employees, as former employees, have their support with the career services and career resources that they offered, but we're always welcome back in the company. One of the things I want to just briefly plug, since I represent a number of contingent and full-time workers at Airbnb who are currently looking for work, who are incredibly talented people, is a talent website where a lot of them have volunteered to show their profiles to potential employers. So if you are an organization currently hiring, please visit airbnb.com/talent. I think it's a fantastic resource, both for companies looking to hire and for those employees at Airbnb who are incredibly talented and looking for work right now.
And Greg, Denis mentions future opportunities. Talk me through what you're thinking about for your next opportunity. Are you going to stay in tech? Are you considering other industries? We're seeing so many workers on LinkedIn having to pivot what career they thought they were going to have. So I'd love to get your perspective on kind of how you're thinking about your next opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I mean, really, this is so early on in my career. I'm less than a year out of college. So I think I'm hoping to get another opportunity within tech, and specifically at a medium or large size company. I think one really interesting thing that happens during layoffs is people can sort of either go this route of jumping back into a position which resembles their position before they got laid off, or going into sort of an entrepreneurial track and pursuing something like a startup or maybe some side project which might have been at the back of their mind. For me, I think I'm going to go back into industry just because I'm so early on in my career, but I think it's some interesting thing to note for layoffs.
Right. Denis, what about you? You're a little further along in your career. Are you making a switch to healthcare, starting your own tech company? What are top of mind for you?
Those are all great ideas, Caroline. I think for now, because it's so fresh, I've just taken a few days to process. A lot of outpouring of support has been sent my way, for which I'm extremely, extremely grateful. I've certainly been trying to look at further opportunities at working in responsible innovation, much like what I did with Airbnb. I really enjoyed my work. I really enjoyed contributing positively to society. I think over 50,000 people received free temporary housing in their worst hour in disaster as a result of my team's work and a lot of my colleagues. So I think I want to try to stay in that space of making meaningful contribution to society with maybe pressing issues in the world, social discourse, helping communities get through this pandemic and recover, or more particularly helping communities that are more disproportionately affected by this crisis who might not be in my demographic.
Well, Greg, Denis, thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Best of luck with your next opportunity. I know I speak for the stream when I say we learned a lot from your experiences and your insights.
Thank you.
That was Greg and Denis. They're two former Airbnb employees who are navigating the job market right now during this very uncertain time. This is Business Unusual, a live show where we're talking with you about how the coronavirus is impacting the ways that we work. I want to thank Greg and Denis for joining us on today's show, as well as Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, who talked to us about how to lead compassionately and with empathy during these challenging times. We come to you from the LinkedIn news page at 12 noon Eastern every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Tomorrow, my colleague Susie Jackson will be having a conversation about what the future of sports looks like. It shouldn't be one that you will want to miss. So please join us back here on the LinkedIn news page tomorrow at noon Eastern. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much for joining us.